Our next speaker, who this will be kind of closing out the Entheogens really well, is Dr. Dan Engel. Dan has kind of led the way in research, and his background and experience is quite extensive in the plant medicines and the psychedelics. Great thing, Dr. Dan Engel, he's a board-certified psychiatrist and neurologist, and I'm allowed to announce this because it's no longer a secret, I guess, and he can tell you more about it, but he is coming to Austin. He's currently in Boulder, running an integrative psychiatry practice, but he is partnering with some really fabulous people here in Austin to open a center called Kuya, which is slated to open somewhere in July or August up next to Onnit. So it's going to be a healing center that is going to focus on these kind of therapies that we've been talking about. And so I want to introduce you to my friend, Dr. Dan Engel.
Wow, what a beautiful follow-up to that gorgeous presentation and song. And it's really locked me into this Goldilocks experience. I just had a little qualia. Anybody else have qualia today? Zing! So that swung the pendulum way over here. And then I had some CBD from Amma, and that swung it way over here. And that song just kind of locked me straight in the middle. So we're good. We're going to move through a fair bit of material. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds of all the data, but I want to give you a good landscape for this kind of work. I do believe coaches are going to shift the entire paradigm of medicine. And I do believe that this is a welcome invitation for us to get deep into not only some of the data, but really how these medicines are shaping medicine and humanity, and what we get to do together to really orient this field. So we're going to be talking about psychedelics and transformation. How do you take peak states into peak living? And what's that middle ground, so to speak? So a little bit of an overview. I'll share a bit about my background. I'm going to try and stay in one spot. I just tore my MCL, so I'm a little bit rehab moment right now. So I may take a seat, but that's not because I'm trying to be disrespectful to the group. So my background, what I see is the current crisis, what are the solutions, and what's our opportunity. Before we do that, though, it's not lost on me the coincidence that there's another awesome Dr. Dan in the room who sees the same barber that I do, and there's a lot of our brothers also obviously seeing the same barber, so I think we should all get together for a photo op and potentially go for a longevity boy band that might just outlast all of our younger generation. I'm figuring another 60, 70 years, we got a long traction, particularly all the longevity programs that we're on at this point. Disclaimers and provisions. This presentation is technically for informational purposes only. I am a physician, I'm not your physician. These are powerful tools, this is not medical advice. And as powerful tools do deserve due respect, and therefore readiness for use of these tools is highly variable between people. And if you do opt into the stream, so to speak, please make sure that you know who you're working with, that it's a safe space, that you've done your preparation work in order to have an optimized, successful experience, and then know that integration on the backside is where the work really happens. So brief backstory, as Dr. Dan Stickler mentioned, I am certified in psychiatry and neurology. I was introduced to ayahuasca after all my medical training. I was running an integrative psych clinic. We were helping kids and adults get off of psychiatric medications. This was about 15 years ago, so I'm dating myself a little bit. And I learned more about myself with one weekend with ayahuasca than I had in one decade of psychotherapy, including psychiatric training. And at that point, I was sold. So in short order, I closed up my clinic, moved down to the jungle, lived there for a year in an apprenticeship path, no running water, no electricity, no other gringos, just me and the plants, and a teacher that didn't speak any English, and my survival Spanish didn't allow for a whole lot of dialogue. So anytime I had questions, he just said, take it to the plants, which was the best teacher. So to live at the pace of nature was a powerful process. And then upon coming home, I entered the dark night of the soul, so to speak. I was in a suicidal depression for a year, lived in a tent on the backside of my friend's property, because going from living at the pace of nature to living at the speed of our current society was just really intense on my nervous system. And shedding so much of the old, this was essentially my cocoon. This dark night was that liminal space and the rites of passage when you go and you're orchestrated through an evolutionary process that has depth and meaning. And we, unfortunately, as a field of psychiatry, we tend to try and rescue, because that's the standard of care, rescue people from their dark night or the intimacy of their shadow so that they can grow and evolve. Because in the cocoon is when we actually go from caterpillar to butterfly and change our whole worldview and at times up-level our genetic potential. I also authored the Concussion Repair Manual upon coming out, because that's another area that I geek out on after 6 pretty bad concussions. And then all of these, the reason that's relevant too is because if anything, me geeking out on neuroscience gives more validation to the discussion on psychedelics. And now we get to harmonize and bring together these consciousness tools with these very accelerated longevity and performance tools. And that is this growing field of transformational medicine. This is how I started medical school, which was an awesome experience. 2 weeks before medical school, jumped off a pier, hit a sandbar, cracked C5, and ended up in a halo. The other option was internal fixation, but no knife is a good knife for me. And I had the option to take off a year, but it was just, I was still standing on the gas pedal at that point. So let's just get this thing on. And it was a great experience too, because this was my med school ID for 4 years. So on all my medical rotations, I would walk into the room and it was the first thing. It just totally dropped the armor from the patient-physician relationship. And now we can be real people. And they were like, holy shit, something really big happened to you. Great, well, something's happening to me too. And then we could get real with it. And through that reality, I just realized, wow, I'm really getting oriented now towards the humanistic sciences around psychiatry and people and what makes us who we are. Prior to that, I was going surgery or ER medicine, very acquisitional, very hands-on, and this just was like the crack of the cosmic egg, if you know Joseph Chilton Pierce's work. This is me a few years later with 2 of my teachers, Jorge and Sumira. These are 2 beautiful teachers from the Shipibo ayahuasca tradition, outside of a town in Peru called Iquitos, pretty close to where I lived. And I would be remiss if I didn't share the importance of reciprocity to the communities where many of these natural medicines come from, so that we understand sustainability, because our rate of harvesting things like ayahuasca, San Pedro, peyote, iboga, 5-MeO-DMT from the Sonoran Desert toad, these are all sentient animals and plants that take a long time to cultivate. And we are harvesting at much greater rates than of replanting. And if we're here to do good work, not only for ourselves, but to be mindful of the coming generations, then it's up to us to understand our impact to the communities where a lot of these traditions come from, and the communities that are experiencing the global demand of these kind of medicines. So the conversation that we get to be a part of is the full spectrum process of where the medicines come from, how are we giving back in a good way, what's our reciprocity, and what's our Ayni. Ayni, A-Y-N-I, essentially is this term from the Quechua people in northern Peru that means today for you, tomorrow for me. And the recognition that we are all part of this interrelated species, this family of humanity. And I get really excited to see what's going to happen when the coming generations still have access to these tools, because these tools have been cultivated over thousands and thousands of years. Okay, so enough about me. If we're talking about peak living, which is largely what this conversation and conference is about, then it's helpful to talk about hardware, what I would call software too, and lifeware. So hardware and software, if you're thinking about a computer, if you up-level both, that you get a better operating system, how you use that operating system is more of the lifeware arena. So if our outcomes for hardware are performance, vitality, and longevity, we're in the best conversation for that right now. Talking about the new paradigm, talking about the new technologies, how to use them better, not only to live longer, but to live better. And software, if we're talking about the things that build not only what we do, which is more hardware, but who we are and how we use what we can do, how we do what we do. My mom used to say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? It's not just what we are, but how we offer what we are, how we actually live our life, building our character, owning our responsibility, recognizing that if I can turn some kind of experience of suffering into an opportunity, now I can participate and grow. So if I can find meaning and take responsibility, then it changes the narrative. If I can experience and express it with authenticity, which is a little bit what Tal and Cole were talking about before, the authenticity is essentially the narrowing the gap between what's happening inside and what I'm expressing outside. And then in the lifeware arena, if I'm speaking about what I'm here to do, that's my dharma. And if you're connected to your dharma, it'll save you. If you're not, it'll destroy you. This is from a book called The Great Work of Your Life, which is an amazing book I highly recommend. Lifeware is also around fulfillment. Are we offering what we're here to do? And does it feel good in the way we're offering it? And how we live with our environment. Our environment's our home and office. Our environment's our family. Our environment's the natural world. Right? The collective place that we call home. So when I throw something away, it doesn't go away. It just conveniently goes out of my sight and I feel better for a little while. Right? But understanding that we are part of this whole reciprocal system, this living, organized, interwoven, interconnected ecosystem. All of these things are what psychedelics support. If you look at the outcomes of people that go through a transpersonal state, psychedelics, by the way, are not the only way up the mountain. I dig them deeply. You can probably get that by now, but they're not the only way up the mountain. Right? We're all going for the same thing. We're all going for peace, fulfillment, awesomeness, the experience of awesomeness that's in my system and the recognition that you're awesome too and everybody's awesome. Everybody's amazing. Everybody has brilliance and potential. Every life is important. Every soul is unique. There's not a mediocre soul, so to speak. All of these outcomes are specifically what transpersonal states offer. If you look at the outcome measures when people give subjective reports of how they feel when they go through a transpersonal process, this is what they report. Hardware, software, and lifeware, all of them get up-leveled. We'll talk about the downside too and the things to be considerate of. But so it's not just the rosy kind of butterflies. We're gonna talk about full spectrum process. And we're gonna have a little bit of Q&A too. So I'm gonna move fast. Maybe it's because of the qualia. Maybe it's because of all you guys, but I'm just feeling really jazzy. So we're probably gonna move through a lot of information, but take notes so we can have some Q&A time. We're gonna bleed over a little bit into the break. If you guys massively all need to pee at the same time, I won't be offended, but I just want you to know that the Q&A actually is where a lot of the meat and kind of like real world stuff happens. So I'm not just sharing what I think is important, but we can have a dialogue. So the big 5 psychiatric epidemics right now: depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and pain. All of them at epidemic level proportions, even with the advent of fancy pharmaceuticals and the standards of care, which is potentially, well, not even potentially, usually psychopharmacology and cognitive behavioral therapy. Those two by themselves have a mediocre success rate. If you take all of those and combine them into a meta kind of review, the standard of care is around 20 to 30% effective at improving symptoms. Not curing anything, right? Which was what medicines can actually do, so that people no longer even meet diagnostic criteria for any of these. But the standards of care typically doesn't get that. And it's not to say that medicines are more important than psychotherapy, because we're born to bond and a lot of the work happens in the therapeutic process, but they can accelerate the psychotherapy because now you have more information to be able to use in that therapy process. And it might be too, as mentioned, we are an integrated ecosystem. So if we talk about planetary crisis or global change and the stress on our natural resources and all these things, it might be too that how we treat ourselves might be similar to how we treat the environment and our collective mother, so to speak. It's important to remember that the more, like Aubrey said yesterday, if we're feeling really lousy inside, it's easier to treat other people lousy or even to treat our planetary culture lousy. But when you start feeling good and your cup just naturally fills up with joy, then it naturally spills out into the environment. And our interpersonal and collective ecological relationship tends to globally up-level. And I think that's part of what we're going through right now. So if we see crisis as simply a stage in a sequence of events at which future events, for better or worse, is determined, i.e. the turning point, then we can leverage crisis as an opportunity. Because if you know anything about rites of passages traditionally have 3 parts. When you go, and essentially rites of passage is going to another operating system, another phase of development, individually and collectively. The first phase of that is shaking it up. It's disrupting the previous operating system. And then you go into this liminal space or this like in-between world, and then you incorporate and you become integrated into a new way of living. So crisis might be exactly what we need to do in order to, quote unquote, wake up to who we are, how to live the most awesome life, and then provide in a good way to the collective. That's what we're here to do. Why are we hearing more and more and more and more about medicines? Magazines, books, an amazing book. Who knows how to change your mind? Wow, there's not near enough of you. You guys got to know this book. It's really good. It was written by the right person at the right time. Michael Pollan, something like 6 or 8 time best-selling author, wrote the best book in the recent decade about the history of psychedelic psychotherapy, the psychedelic research that was going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, why it went into hiatus for 30 years, and why it's coming back now. Movies, the psychiatric environment. 12 years ago when I was living in when I was living in ayahuasca, because I was living in ayahuasca, actually. I married the medicine, didn't want to come back, didn't think I was going to come back. So I was living in ayahuasca. No one was really speaking about Aya or medicine work as much as we are today, especially in the medical community. My colleagues that knew I moved down to study ayahuasca, they thought I was off the reservation. And, well, I was, but who wants to be normal? So it's helpful to talk about languaging too. If we're talking about psychedelics versus drugs, Tal and Cole were talking about this last talk too, which is it's helpful to distinguish between recreational use and therapeutic use. Data moves science, but story moves culture. So the data is really good. The data is really good in the therapeutic arena. And I'm not against recreational use. I think we have civil liberties for a reason. People should explore, ideally in safe arenas so that they don't create more trauma. Last thing we need to do is create more trauma. But the data that I want to speak about is in regards to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in a supported therapeutic context versus drugs, which are usually used either recreationally or to anesthetize pain. Because if we're in the midst of pain and suffering and we have in our availability certain things that will take that pain down, then we're going to use it. And so it's not a judgment at all. It's just a recognition that we are creative beings and we're going to use the tools in our environment, and everybody's always using the best tools that they know at that given time with the information that they have. So let's delineate intention, setting, and outcome. If you're talking about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or a therapeutic context, it doesn't even necessarily have to be like in a clinic. Like if you're going down to do a retreat with known providers in a sacred context and they know how to facilitate that, like a neurosurgeon, so to speak, then the intention is growth. The setting is therapeutic. The outcome is integrative, typically integrating more of our parts, including our shadow material, including those things that we shame, we guilt, particularly when those core wounds have been healed. Versus if we're using these medicines to distance from that pain, If we're using them in a setting of isolation, the outcome is disconnected. We're disconnected from the core wounds that we're trying to become more connected to in order to heal and become more whole. And there's bias in both directions. There's people that think medicines are all good. They're part of our religious freedom. They're required for our evolution, that everybody's ready and that they're totally safe. And on the other side of the spectrum, people think that medicines are all bad. Anybody remember the fried egg commercial? This is your brain on drugs? Who remembers the fried egg commercial? Who freaked out from the fried egg commercial? For sure. I didn't touch anything for like a decade because of that. Although I would drink myself silly because that was like the okay thing to do. We're rehabbing that whole media paradigm. There are people that think that these are highly addictive. And in fact, most of these medicines fail to be even qualified for Schedule 1, which means that they're illegal, can't use, you're going to go to prison. That's been, yeah, who else is ready for that paradigm to shift? Right. Right. Most of these medicines are anti-addictive if you look at the data, if they're used in a therapeutic setting. We could go into a lot of the data, and maybe I'll share some of that if the Q&A is oriented towards that. There are people that think the medicines are all bad, they're dangerous, and they may even be unholy. I'm a recovering staunch Buddhist. I took the monastic rites. I was going to go into like that process deeply. I did go into that process deeply, and one of those rites is you won't take any mind-altering substances. And you know, there's a rehabilitation of bringing different traditional therapeutic context into the contemporary offering. It was great to hear that the earliest Taoists were also using plant medicines. And it's a recognition that we are at an inflection point, because many people that were first exploring medicines in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are now the generation that are leading a lot of the political campaigns. And with a book like How to Change Your Mind, there's a remembering like, oh, I tripped in the 50s, 60s. I didn't lose my mind. And now you're telling me that these medicines are really good for the things that I'm afflicted by or my family's afflicted by. Now I'm more curious. So there's a whole renaissance happening as these medicines are the great instigators. They are the primary disruptive technologies. They catalyze consciousness. They are historically used as rites of passage ceremonies for thousands of years. And we should remember that transcendence is a primary drive for the human operating system. Procreation is a primary drive. Service is a primary drive. Love is a primary drive. Expression, wisdom, growth, and transcendence. And if our primary drives get subjugated or repressed, then it comes out in a distorted way, usually as violence. This is from a book called The Biology of Transcendence by Joseph Chilton Pearce. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy has 3 parts: preparation, experience, and integration. And let's look just briefly about how these medicines work. This blue area in the middle is the limbic system. Most of these medicines work primarily on that limbic system. There's a term now being used over the last couple of years called the default mode network. Essentially, this is the address of the ego. It lives in the limbic system, in the dorsal part of the limbic system, or like a back upper part of the limbic system. The default mode network tends to quiet in the psychedelic transpersonal state, which means the address of the ego, our usual operating system, starts to relax and soften. So we can see things differently. That also includes our fear center relaxing, which means we become less armored and more available to get into the deeper work. And sometimes that includes trauma work, or maybe more like chronic trauma that wasn't like, oh, I went off to war and I saw my friends got blown up, but maybe it was some degree of a core wound that I've been inhibited by, because we all walk around with our own ecologically derived neuroses, right? And those core wounds being rejection, abandonment, humiliation, betrayal, injustice. And core wounds of the psyche, of the soul, those 2 terms are synonymous, particularly in Greek philosophy. So medicines tend to do beautiful things in the psyche as they help us become less armored, they tend to up-level the connection between the memory center and the hippocampus and the green area in the front right, like part of your forehead. Right behind this skull plate in the front is the prefrontal cortex, where we tend to be able to have more of a witness perspective. And with those three things, less armor, better memory of the context of the original experience that happened, and more of a witness, now we can recodify that narrative and turn it into a restored sense of wholeness. Restoration is restoration. It's creating a new narrative, creating a new story of who I am and who I choose to be. This is also related to preparation, experience, and integration. Preparation is very much around dealing with the red part, which is the brainstem, reptilian areas of fight or flight mechanism. We've been talking a lot about sympathetic overdrive. It lives in the one of the primary primitive areas of the brain. So preparation should include the training of how to find psychological and neurological integration connected to a parasympathetic rest and relaxation state at will. That's part of the preparation. If you can't find that place on your own, at least for a little while, at choice, and you haven't started to put yourself into challenging situations at choice, you don't want your first experience to be in a psychedelic state. Like, it's not great to build your bug out bag when the house is burning down. It's great to try and start working on resting your nervous system and get ready for the journey ahead. Meditation, neurofeedback, flotation, breathing, pranayama, those things that rest so that we can prepare and then do the journey ahead. And then the chances of success are a lot higher. The experience tends to happen in the blue zone, right? We're just talking about the emotional state and the limbic state getting recalibrated. And the integration is that story, that restoration. So all three work, and this is by no means like preparation is only in this red part of the brain. These are loosely and interwoven areas of interconnectivity, as we are quite complex beings. So what's being restored? I love so much that so many of the talks have been using this term wholeness. It's very much that's what's happening. Restoring us from separation or disintegration or fragmentation, as Mario Martinez was mentioning, fragmentation into wholeness. This picture is from Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Right? The hero and heroine's journey, by the way. The hero and heroine get called into action, usually at the soul level, because the ego is going to go through a disruptive process, which the ego typically does not like to have. Goes through a disruptive process into the abyss or the cave or the unknown to come out more whole. That is the internal treasure. And so what do we see healed? What do we see become more whole? Our minds, because the core wounds that I just mentioned, that's not an exhaustive list, but that's most of them. Rejection, injustice, humiliation, betrayal, abandonment. Now we can come to a greater state of what's called sufficiency. I'm enough. And then we move from sufficiency into awesomeness. Like, not only am I enough, I'm fucking rad. And not only am I rad, like, all you guys are rad. Because I'm now more related with my mirror neurons, less in fight or flight and more in interconnectivity, intersubjectivity. We also are able to find more meaning in our suffering. There was a mention and a shout out to Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. Who knows that book? Still not enough. That's number 2. Homework. It's so good because when you know what that guy went through and found meaning in his suffering, he raised the bar and he's made of the same cosmic dust. Made of the same stuff. If he can do it, I can do it. That's what brought me out of my dark night of the soul. Reading that book over and over and over and over again. Knowing like, oh wow, if he can do it, I can do it. And then there were no excuses. Reclaiming our belonging, interconnectivity, as mentioned. We are part of a community. I loved Aubrey's answer last night too. Like, what's the most evolutionary, cool peak performance technology that's gonna help save humanity? Community. Interconnectivity, recreating a sense of bond is we're here to bond. You give an infant choice between food and love, it's going to choose love every time. We're born to bond more than any other primary drive. Power to the people. Restoration, life's calling. Right? So this is from, okay, if I could give you a third book. Who knows James Hillman? Dope. Soul's Code. The guy was such a heavy. He's no longer on the planet. He wrote so clearly about soul. And most codified medical traditions that have stood the test of time, or at least like Apeiron, that name is built on codified Greek philosophy around peak performance and longevity. The Greeks were also super stoked to speak about soul and the translation of psyche into soul, and also soul as the metaphor between psyche and soul is actually the butterfly. Those three are used synonymously and were used to mean the same thing, as the butterfly is this archetypal process of recognized transformation. It's the only known living structure, living essence, living being on the planet that totally changes its genetic code through its life cycle. Which means and it's in the cocoon, it's in this amorphous little bubble. It's absolutely not what it was, and it's not yet who it will be. So when we go through this restoration, through this process, we have the opportunity to recreate who we choose to be in an accelerated way more than any other powerful tool on the planet right now. So if we do codify systems into different parts of the self, mind, body, heart, it's kind of like three-dimensional operating system. I have a mind, I have a body, I have a heart. Everybody kind of gets that. It's hard to argue with those. Now, when you start talking about spirit, people are like, oh, are you talking about God? And if you're talking about God, then maybe your God and my God don't get along, because that's religion and that's dogma. So then you get a little edgy. But now when you start talking about soul, that's even more edgy, because people are like, I don't even know what that means. But it might just be that part of this transformational medicine process is re-inhabiting the soul, reclaiming a recognition and a discussion on soul, so that we recognize that we are interwoven, interconnected beings. And a large part of this process of going into a transpersonal state is actually going down into the underworld. This is more of a shamanic tradition. Some of this work is based in Bill Plotkin's work around the nature of the soul and soul craft. And recognizing that we go into the cave to reclaim a connection with our soul so that we experience life as a more interconnected being, including our connection with the divine. The name of 1,000 names is like ineffable and hard to actually put into language. But that we find a way to codify all these aspects of ourself into a more integrated experience of wholeness. If we're talking about medical models that we want to shift the whole paradigm, let's talk about salutogenesis. Is that a new term to a lot of people? Who hasn't heard that term? Oh, great. Salutogenesis is a health-oriented system, a health-oriented model. Apeiron's very much a health-oriented model. Not only health-oriented, but it's peak performance-oriented. So this is totally different from our current medical mainstream, which is a disease-oriented model. It's an illness-oriented model. Oh, by the way, the physicians of antiquity used to only get paid when their clients were well. How cool would that be? I mean, I'm up for that. I don't think a lot of my colleagues are up for that. But if we do recognize that in order for everybody to be fully what they're here to do, fully turned on and alive in all of their systems, the best way to achieve that is to have a health-oriented system versus a disease-oriented system. These are just 25 different characteristics of what it looks like to be expressed through a health-oriented system. So you'll see resilience, empowerment, meaning, efficacy, hardiness, humor, connectedness, a lot of things we've already spoken about. I would leave this up, but we've got more to talk about. Psychedelic Solutions. So this was kind of like, all that was just prep work for this part of the conversation. These are the top 10 medicines that are being currently used and studied and researched in the medical mainstream right now. Ketamine, cannabis. The reason those are underlined is because those are the ones that are legal right now. Well, cancel clear. Texas is a little far behind. So ketamine is the only one legal here. Cannabis will happen soon. Psilocybin Mdma are asterisks because those are the ones going to be legal in the next 18 months, plus or minus. They're both going into phase 3 trials. They've both been proven for safety and efficacy. Now they're going on bigger trials. They've also both been green-lighted by the FDA, MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for depression. LSD, those 5 are in white. Those are level 1 medicines. Level 1 medicines mean they're fairly easy to navigate. They're fairly easy to facilitate. You've got a fairly high likelihood of success, as long as you've at least started working with settling your nervous system, to have a positive experience. Level 2 medicines are ayahuasca, peyote, and San Pedro. They come from thousands of years of tradition. It takes an extra degree of awesomeness in the facilitation role, particularly to know how to work as a spiritual EMT, like how to intervene on behalf of your client or the person going through a really bad experience, and also knowing when to not intervene, knowing when to not save somebody from their suffering, because it might be their best teacher. Ibogaine and DMT, level 3 medicines, because of the size and scope of the experience. Ibogaine and Iboga happen to also be the longest lasting medicines to go through a process. Iboga was 40 hours for me, both times. I was like, oh, there's no way it could be 40 hours both times. And it was. So it's really about knowing how to pace yourself in a nervous system when you're going through that kind of process. And DMT is very short, but nothing will encourage the ego to die like DMT. Your ego gets catapulted out of your body as you go meet God. And for a lot of people, that feels like death and dying because, oh, by the way, DMT is primarily expressed at the time of birth, at the time of death, and then when we go through these transpersonal practices like holotropic breath work. So I'm just going to explore one of those. I'd love to talk about all 10. I love talking about this stuff for hours and days, but given the fact that we only have a little bit more time, psilocybin. We've likely been using psilocybin for 1 million years. It goes back in 1 million years in the fossil records. Anybody that knows the stone ape theory from Terence and Dennis McKenna? It's quite likely that we were foraging on psilocybin mushrooms, just small doses, microdosing as we were like bumbling around as Homo erectus. And then, oh, by the way, when we doubled our brain volume in a very short period of time, about 200,000 years ago, it might have been quite likely that it was psilocybin starting to incorporate that synaptogenic potential so that we could start growing into more intelligent and creative beings. It was synthesized in Sandoz Labs in 1959. Efficacy, it's good for all 5. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and pain, as well as end-of-life transition. Its mechanism is interconnectivity in the brain, as well as stimulating BDNF. We already talked about that in one of the last talks. And the default mode network. We already talked about that in this talk. The actions are primarily through 4-phosphoryloxyl DMT. And when it's converted from psilocybin to psilocin, that's its active constituent, lasts 4 to 6 hours in the system. Safest use profile, there's no LD50. You could take a bucket load, a trash bag load, a truckload of psilocybin, mushrooms. And the worst that would happen is you'd likely puke it out. I'm not recommending that, by the way. I've already tried to try that. It's not good. But natural medicines you tend to get out of your system. Synthetics, if you take too much, is usually in for the ride. Like LSD, ketamine, MDMA, you can't really puke or get those out. The natural medicines tend to be built-in safeguards. Research, King's College, Hopkins, NYU, Hefter. I'll put some research slides and links where you can get this. The reason I want to go through all of that, because pictures are worth an innumerable amount of words, this is, just like Julie was talking about in the last presentation, this is your brain on drugs. On the left is a normal brain, composite fMRI. On the right is about 3 to 4 grams of oral psilocybin. That's the number of interconnectivity, neuronal and neuroanatomical highways that are getting activated through psilocybin. So no wonder it's really good for creativity. No wonder it's really good for seeing things in a different way because your brain's turning on in a different way. Oh, by the way, it's also the safest. This is a safety use profile, U.S. Drug Policy 2006. You see heroin and morphine in the top right corner. High lethality, high addiction. Opposite that is LSD and psilocybin, low lethality, low addiction. And in the middle, you'll see things like nicotine, caffeine, alcohol. Much more dangerous, much more addictive than either of those. And this is Global Drug Survey 2017. This is safety on the streets, which means who presents to the ER tripping and not having a good time? Magic mushrooms far right, lowest. even lower than cannabis. On the left, you see methamphetamine. In the middle, amphetamine, cocaine, LSD. Magic mushrooms are the safest. So that was just a little bit about psilocybin. And again, we could go into as much of that data and more on all 10, but in the interest of our time, we won't today. What's our current research looking like? There's a lot of research happening all around healing and optimization. Not only healing one of the big five or something else, but also going from good to great. Yeah, and just being like, oh, wow, I'm already awesome. What does it look to be even more awesome? Because if I wasn't here to grow any further, I might not still be in a hairless monkey suit. I might have already exited the situation. We're always here to polish the diamond and grow further. So these medicines are extraordinarily good for optimization as well. Models to meet the need. I like this picture, not because I like the intonation, but it's important to know that there's a lot happening right now in the arena of addictionology. There are a lot of people horribly afflicted by the opioid epidemic. Stuck on pain medications, can't afford them anymore, can't access them anymore, the crackdown is happening, and now finding their connection through heroin. Because actually, in some ways, heroin's cleaner and safer because it's usually pure and there's less side effects. Like, if you're going for an opioid, it's better to use that than someone like Percocets or Dilaudid. The reason I'm putting this into models to meet the need is there are a lot of models that are happening now in the therapeutic arena. There's one in Oregon going vote this year for a therapeutic legal model. And that's for people over 21 that get cleared for medical and psychological safety, can opt in at their leisure at a licensed facility with registered providers in a 3-session minimum. That means it's a hybrid model. You don't have to have a medical diagnosis in order to opt in, and it's not recreational legalization yet, because I don't actually think we're ready for recreational legalization. We need to have a lot more of these kind of conversations first. So I just want to put this on your radar, because there are significant inroads happening in the arena of legalization and decriminalization right now. What's the hype and the lack? Well, there's a ton of excitement. There's no sexier topic in the medical mainstream right now than psychedelics. But the challenge is you have a lot of people talking about psychedelics who don't have a lot of experience. You even have people running ketamine clinics who have no experience. Drop people into a big experience, they're like, okay, see you later, here's your Uber. You have people that don't know anything about preparation, or their facilitators don't know about preparation. The container isn't around therapeutic experience. There's little integration, and there's lack of professionalism in the arena right now. We don't have codes of ethics or standards of care. We're developing those right now. There's little depth in knowing that this transformational process can be really quite big. There may not be ethics even in the space because ketamine is a hot topic. It's really great profit margins. 10 years ago, there was like a dozen ketamine clinics. Now there's like 350 because the profit margins are really good. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I'm saying right now we need to check our ethics as a community of providers. And there's also little consideration. Consideration to the whole conversation. Consideration to the sustainability, particularly when it comes to natural medicines we already spoke a little bit about. Just a few more slides. So our opportunity as a group, recognizing that there's a mental health crisis, we are in the arena of new therapy and research. The safety, efficacy, and cost savings is clear. That's why there's more and more people curious. And we are together through these kind of conversations. What we're doing at Kuya, launching this summer, is creating this field of transformational medicine together. Because allopathic medicine has dominated the last 100 years. That turned into functional medicine, which was better, but it's still reductionistic. That's turning in now to peak performance medicine and transformational medicine. We're on the cusp of a rising new paradigm, par none, that we haven't seen before. So what does transformational medicine look like? In a nutshell, software technologies, consciousness tools, combined with hardware technologies, regenerative medicine tools, peak performance tools, combine in this container of a transformational process to support people going through an evolutionary experience. So we've talked about crisis. Is the opportunity the solution? Is transformation? The time is now. The data is clear. Each of us has a role. And here are some research links. I'll just leave this slide up as the last one. And thank you for paying attention. So I think we are in the midst of a break, and feel free to take care of yourself in the best way, or stick around for questions. And if there's questions, I'll answer those until I get the cane dragging me off the stage.
Questions?
Great. That means everybody's super ready. I mean, for the new paradigm, not necessarily for a medicine experience right now.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm curious what your thoughts are in a more performance-oriented model of
Speak up,
psychedelic. In your view, in a performance-oriented model, there's a lot of attention to psychedelics plus therapy in the mental health model right now, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on the role of a therapeutic context or coaching, with psychedelics, and how that relates to just the medicines or substances themselves.
Great question. So what can happen with these medicines? You can come through two different doorways. You can come through a healing doorway, right? Like maybe I have affliction with depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and pain. Maybe I'm on a medication I can't get off of. Maybe I have chronic pain in my body. It doesn't necessarily feel mental, but it usually is. You can also come in the optimization door, and again, go from good to great. The cool thing is you use the same technologies, but you typically tweak the variables. So for example, at Kuya, what we do is use a lot of the same therapeutics, IVs, medicine work, flotation, neuromodulation, neurofeedback. We might tweak the variables and the frequency or how many sessions a person needs in order to get to a healing or optimization process. I tend to think that in the usual medical model, people come in crisis. And then they experience the healing arts, and then they go into performance, and then they go into transcendence. So it's typically an evolutionary process in the medical model. Now, in an optimization model, you can come in at any one of those points. And a huge differentiator is what you're telling yourself about that story. And what those around you are telling yourself about that story. Are those people saying, wow, you've got depression, you're going to have it for life? That's a victimization model, and it's not a model of empowerment that allows me optimism to know that I can heal this and transcend it. If you're welcomed into the space, getting like, whoa, you've had depression for a long time. What's that been like for you? Is there a way that you might be able to access a restoriation? It's called narrative therapy, if we wanted to put a term to it. Can we start to put you through a process that gives you tools to tell yourself something differently about who you really are at the core of your being and what you're here and potentially here to do? And if you have a community that's oriented towards that kind of narrative, if you have a community of people that are all growing together, then now you've just healed the isolation that typically drives that healing process. So in a peak performance model, we're using a lot of the same variables. The intention is a little different. The depth of contact is oftentimes different. But not always. Because some people who are functioning really well might go through a process and start uncovering stuff that they didn't realize that they had. Micra said the same thing about her process. I wouldn't just say that if she hadn't just shared that. But I want to just highlight, that was a big reveal. She was willing to share that with you guys, and I've had the same thing happen. Ayahuasca was so transformative for me. I didn't know I was going for healing anything, but when all my shadow material that I had been shaming or blaming or guilting or stuffing away came into the space, it was clear that there was something else available. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Totally. Other questions? We're good. Great. Well, thank you guys. Totally. It's been a pleasure.